suboptimal pH can really make a difference. So if it states a specific pH, it really needs to be at that, or it's not going to be as effective. Insufficient wet contact times, as you were pointing out. You're not leaving it on there wet long enough, and that's hard. I know that is. You're so tempted to want to just clean it off right away. But you really have to read, okay, how long this is, and sometimes it will list you, if you're going to be this type of organism, you need this much time. If you're instead having outbreaks with this, you can still use this, but it must be done much longer.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Wava Truscott. And she's a microbiologist with extensive experience in the healthcare industry. She is incredibly passionate about it, and she has studied it at the smallest level of detail. And when I say smallest level of detail, I'm also talking about small colony variants and bacterium, etc. I think this is the first time she's been on the First Case podcast, but she's been on the entire family of podcasts, presented several times, webinars and virtual conferences, and she is just incredible, and she's going to have a lot of great info for us today, Melanie.
Yeah, she's definitely the one we want to talk to when we want to break it down to the smallest particle and what's going on with infection and the different bacteria and viruses that we have in the OR, in the hospital. She's got a lot of insight to share, and I think some of her statistics are going to be a little mind-blowing, but it's good. And it's all to improve the care that we give.
All right, we're going to be right back with Dr. Wava Truscott.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Today we are speaking with Dr. Wava Truscott, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Clinical Education at Shield Technology Incorporated and President of Truscott MedSci Associates, LLC. Wava, you and I go back quite a ways. You've been on several episodes of the Beyond Clean podcast. You've been on the Transmission Control podcast. You've done a number of conferences and webinars. And as far as I'm concerned, you're one of the first and foremost authorities on infection prevention in this industry. And I'm so excited to have you join us on a First Case podcast. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things like disinfectants and environmental contamination. We might even get into some particulates and some nuanced areas around anesthesiology and the role that anesthesiologists play in infection prevention. So with that, welcome to the First Case podcast.
Thank you so much, Justin. I appreciate it.
Why don't you, I know I kind of teed it up there a little bit and talked about, how much influence you've had over the industry in terms of like doing studies and research and just moving things forward. But maybe you could tell everybody in your own words about the work that you've done throughout your career.
Oh, let's see. I'm getting old, so this list is longer than most, I'm sure, because I'm so old now. But I started off in testing laboratories for medical device safety, acquired my degree in comparative pathology with human and animal disease systems to work on medical device safety. I started off at Baxter Healthcare, and at the same time, there was HIV. With HIV, of course, everybody needed to be in gloves. And believe it or not, only 5% of dentists were in gloves at the time. So unfortunately, we needed to really make a lot of gloves really, really fast for all that needed to be done. And it turned out that the way that the increased speed with which we needed the trees to give latex out, actually produced allergens and stress proteins. So I worked with CDC and FDA to identify those and went on then later on to work on powder reduction. It was fairly recent that the United States has finally banned all powdered gloves. And I have worked with Safe Skin Corporation and with Kimberly-Clark Corporation. I've started my own company, Truscott MedSci Associates, and am currently working as one of the founders, helping out with Shield Technology, a new glove and PPE United States made in America product line. My love is microbiology and immunology. And so as we talk today, we'll be kind of throwing that in there just because I get so excited about it. One of the things I'd like to point out, if you don't mind, would be Florence Nightingale. I know that sounds like a strange project to start off a modern program with, but it's very important. In the Crimea, which we also are it's a very current topic right now, but the war and the Crimean War is when Florence Nightingale approached the military, much to the frustration of her family, and found that so many of the individuals were dying from their infections from a shot or a wound than they were from the actual wound. 42% of the wounded soldiers died before disinfection started. She went into the hospitals and cleaned them up and then turned around and did disinfectants and would check on all the individuals at night with the lamp, and thus she became the Lady of the Lamp and the initiation of disinfection in hospitals. After the 6 months, that 42% fell to only 2% of the wounded individuals died. It made just a huge difference, and thus started the world in disinfection in the hospitals.
We have a lot to thank her for sure. I know that she really laid the foundation for our infection prevention practices, and a lot of the things that we practice today, we can trace back to her and other trailblazers in nursing care. And thinking of that and the improvements that she made, and then the things that we know feeds into this whole season of infection prevention and how can we take care of our patients? How can we improve our care? And how can we be aware so that we know what's going on? And when we think of awareness, I think we can think about environmental contamination. What are some of the specifics like pathogens that might be concerning, and what are the likelihood that they can be transferred to other areas?
Good question. Some of the most prolific and often associated with contact transfer and infections that way would be like Staphylococcus aureus, and MRSA, of course, is something that comes to mind right away. The Enterococcus, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, Clostridium difficile. And then over in the viruses, we have rotavirus and norovirus, which is an extremely difficult to get rid of, SARS, coronavirus, and influenza. And then the fungus, even Aspergillus, would be an issue in contact transfer. And it's important to know that, okay, let's just pretend that it's on the bed or in the operating room in some particular area that is missed. Or it's the weekend. Hey, everything dies over the weekend, right?
Right.
That's unfortunately many people do believe that, and it's just not true. That's usually comes with a little bit of organics during the transfer, whether it's a sputum or something like that, and those organisms can continue to multiply. Or even if they don't, organisms live a long time. Let me give you an example. Acinetobacter is 3 days to, are you ready for this? 5 months.
No. Whoa.
Yes. Clostridium difficile, it's almost like a golf ball, so it lasts for a long time. In fact, 5 months.
Wow.
E. coli, 1.5 hours to 16 months. And of course, it's is it dry? Is it wet? Is it warm? Is it freezing? All these different things would play into how long something would stay. Enterococcus, 5 days to 4 months.
Whoa.
Pseudomonas, 6 hours to 16 months. And dry floors, we talk about, they don't need to put on booties or something. Many places do not, in fact. And they find that, for example, the Pseudomonas can stay for 5 weeks on dry floors. So you can imagine how you easily could be picking that up and taking it to other places. Staph aureus, it would be 7 days to 7 months. Streptococcus pyogenes is 3 days to 6.5 months. Aspergillus is months or longer. Candida albicans, Candida is 1 to 120 days. HBV is 2 hours to 60 days. HIV is more than 7 days, and papillomavirus is more than 7 days. So these are long time that you can easily go and pick them up.
And they're going to be on any surface. They can be on the floor, they can be on the wall, a light switch, a phone. Is that true? I mean, can we find these things anywhere?
Absolutely. Or even when you're washing your hands in the lavatory, they could be splashed out in different areas.
Wow.
Or if you're using a blower, the blower doesn't kill the organisms, so any that are still in your hands will be thrown around the room.
In the air. Can they get aerosolized?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They can be aerosolized and then also, depending upon the bacterium, fall down and be on surfaces as well. Taken home by visitors, in fact.
That gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Yes, I know. And you think, look, I just touched that and my hand is perfectly fine. It's not wet. It's nothing like that. But something like E. coli, in a study that was done fairly recently, they found that E. coli, when touched and moved away, the person moves away, they find out that 100% of the time, they do capture organisms if they turn around then and put them on a plate that will grow with that specific organism.
Wow.
Staphylococcus 100% of the time also. 2 bad guys, right? It just had this in the study. It was 90% and HIV was 22%. So it does vary some depending upon the different organisms, but some of the bad guys are the worst for contact transfer.
Wow. So, and we get taught time and time again the fundamental importance of hand washing in infection prevention and how important it is to adequately and accurately wash our hands thoroughly so that we don't transfer pathogens to each other, to our patients, anything like that. But you also want to think about maybe disinfectants. Is there something that's the best for an OR, or is it pathogen specific, or something that we can be using in the ASC or the hospital that's going to be a disinfectant that's going to take care of all of these pathogens?
That's a very good question. I would also like to hit on is some of the things we forget about disinfecting. And just to give you one example as we start is that in 73% of the rooms, MRSA contamination is on surfaces, which we talked about and how easy that is to transfer, underlining the importance of those disinfectants. The interesting part is that people forget to disinfect things like where you put used syringes. Where do you put your used syringes? Do you really wipe those down? They found that many hospitals just don't even think about wiping those down and can have high numbers of bacteria and viruses. So, and as we talk about these bacteria, a moment ago we talked about it splattering sometimes and multiplying. It's important to note that a person who is working, let's say a 7-hour shift, which never happens that short, but let's say it is in this case, that you can go from one bacteria, it doesn't take 2 to multiply here, so just one bacteria can split and divide, and within that 7-hour shift, that can become 2 million bacteria, over 2 million bacteria.
Wow.
Staphylococcus too.
That's a busy little germ.
A busy germ. So to go back to what you asked me as far as the disinfectant, the answer is, unfortunately, bacteria just aren't, I wish they would all die at the same rate, but they don't. For instance, if you were to use alcohol to try and kill the C. difficile that we talked about, it's helpless. It doesn't do anything. It even makes it just kind of dries it off and makes it tougher. So, one, it's very important to choose the right disinfectant for what's happening. Also, to make sure it's not going to destroy something. There's just so many things about a disinfectant. let's say I want to kill everything and I'm feeling very good about that and I work really hard, and an individual who was having an outbreak or a hospital is having an outbreak, individual worked very hard to clean every bed, mattress, just very, very well with a high concentration of Clorox, and unfortunately it destroyed every bed, and they were new beds because the plastic could not handle that level of disinfectant. So unfortunately, we need to think about what we're going to be disinfecting, what the organism is, and if you were to look at the easiest organism killed, it would be like what we just had with coronavirus. It's the envelope viruses that are the easiest to deactivate. Once you lose their envelope, it destroys it. They can't affect a human anymore. And then there are the gram-positive bacteria with Staphylococcus, with the gram-negative bacteria like E. coli, the fungi, which are harder to kill. And each time I'm mentioning the next one, it is harder and harder to kill. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is very hard to kill. And then bacterial spores that we talked about earlier. And prions are just about impossible, extremely hard. So what do you do? And there are lists that, and I'll certainly be happy to share these with you, of what type of disinfectants, meaning not a brand, but a type of disinfectant, whether it's the quaternaries or it's up to peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide combinations for the different organisms. So that's a whole area to study, and each of them will kill different types of bacteria if you're having an outbreak, for instance.
With our disinfectants, too, it's also very important, and I think you're hinting at this too, but paying attention to that IFU on the disinfectant that we're using. What is it made for? What is the dwell time? How long does it take to kill whatever it is approved to kill? And paying attention to those IFUs so that we're following, so that whatever disinfectant that we use, we're actually using it correctly to do the job it's supposed to do.
And Melanie, that's an excellent question, because unfortunately it's often is not ignored. It's just people don't think about the fact they need to look a little further. It needs to be the appropriate disinfectant concentration, not a guess, but you really need to do it properly. Portions of each thing that needs to be added. Suboptimal pH can really make a difference. So if it states a specific pH, it really needs to be at that, or it's not going to be as effective. Insufficient wet contact times, as you were pointing out. You're not leaving it on there wet long enough, and that's hard. I know that is. You're so tempted to want to just clean it off right away. But you really have to read, okay, how long this is, and sometimes it will list you, if you're going to be this type of organism, you need this much time. If you're instead having outbreaks with this, you can still use this, but it must be done much longer. In some cases, even 10 minutes. So it just depends on what the disinfectant is. And then beyond that, also making sure that there's often an expiration as far as after you dilute this, you use it for only so long, or even the disinfectant itself on the main container, making sure that it's not depleted, because many of them will break down. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it does. And I didn't think about the fact that they will break down. Like if it's a concentration you have to mix up or something you have to make, it actually has an expiration on that. And to pay attention to the time that it's okay to still be using is something to think about when you're making your disinfectants. That's a very interesting thought.
And when you do too, I'm sure that, we have different times that people are coming in to use that disinfectant. It really does need to be taped on there or on something that states, I made this on such and such a date, and it will expire on such and such a date.
That's interesting. Very good to think about. Okay, so I want to move the conversation to something a little different that might make people perk their ears up just a little bit. But we're going to talk about anesthesia and infection prevention. And when we talked before, we talked about how maybe anesthesia might not be as tuned in to some of the critically important infection prevention procedures that we have to follow. Is that a possibility, or what's going on with anesthesia?
It is a very interesting question, and it's one that's been perplexing a lot of times for a lot of hospitals, and we really do need to focus on it. Think about something like syringe use. You would think you use it once and throw it out, right? Well, unfortunately, in this particular study, 52 surgical patients acquired hepatitis C, were injected with the IV ports using the same syringe and needle by the cRNA. So they decided, okay, jeepers, can't I just save money somewhere? And what they did was to try it. They said, okay, I realize that this has been a problem. So a one-way valve, let's just put a one-way valve on it. No, it did not make a difference. The virus was still there. So they was still able to be transferred. Then they found if a needle was changed, but they used the same syringe, would that be okay? And the answer is no. The viruses are so tiny and just so grabby onto things, and that's my technical terminology. They continue to be an issue. It truly needs to be one syringe for one patient. And that's the whole syringe, and it needs to be thrown out. And that doesn't mean even in the OR to transferring it and using it multiple times. You just can't do that. It's just not worth it, the risk. A survey of 2,530 anesthetists, 39% reused their syringes. So this isn't something
Really?
that is rare that I'm talking about. This really is a concern.
I was honestly thinking most of them were single use, even when you said that earlier in the interview. So this is a very interesting development as it ties back to just some of the statistics you were sharing to kick this off.
It truly is. Another survey, so it's not just one, but another one, 34% did not disinfect multi-use container stoppers and just continued to use them, pressing in and out without disinfecting between uses. And needless to say, time goes by, organisms are in the air, people touch that part, the exterior parts of the needle will actually go back in. So these are things that can carry those bacteria from one patient to another. And to really try to address that, only recently, 2018, Shea actually wrote an excellent guideline for anesthetists, and every anesthetist should have it. And I believe that they are totally free as well. For instance, they do address things like environmental disinfection of their own area in between patients. Very often, they are not thoroughly disinfected. The thought is, gee, this isn't right next to the patient. This is not an issue. But we talked about contact transfer. We talked about, just going up to touch the face of the patient or the different apparatus after they've touched their own equipment. It really needs to be thoroughly disinfected between patients and very cautiously thought about as they're touching things. IV drug injection recommendations using the syringes and vials. And the vials, that's the other thing I meant to mention, only once. Rather than dipping into it, I still have some left over, I'll use it for the next patient, is just not something that is acceptable.
So I know that we're coming to the end of this conversation, but before we wrap it all up, I wanted to ask about small colony variants. Can you talk about that and what's been going on with what we're learning about those?
It's really a fascinating subject. Take Staphylococcus, for instance. As it grows, if we start to pressure it, in other words, I'm going to come and kill you, Staphylococcus, the inside dynamics of the bacteria will start to change. As we've seen in antibiotic resistance, well, there were other things that happened too, and one of them is called the small colony variant. You'll see as you plate it out that lots of bacteria, right, big colonies and everything. Well, there are also some tiny ones. Now, they take a couple more weeks, perhaps, to show up, so very often we miss them. But they are amazing little creatures. They actually go inside something like an epithelial cell, totally unrecognized by the rest of the body, and multiply there slowly and can come out later. Now, this is one of the reasons that some people who have, maybe it's a hip replacement or something, and they get an infection, and then they're fine, that infection is taken care of, but maybe 3 months later they have another one. The same bug that keeps the Staphylococcus again and again, and this can keep repeating because small colony variants can hide inside the tissues, and there is often a biofilm that forms over them. They slowly multiply. And one of the things as you go in to test it is you can't find them. The reason being that the colony is totally different than a regular Staphylococcus. You can't recognize it. For instance, in diagnostics, instead of 1 or 2 days, it takes greater than 6 days and often a couple of weeks. The routine rapid diagnostics does not recognize it as a Staphylococcus. In the coagulase production, nope. And yet that's how we used to identify Staphylococcus in the big ones, the regular ones. The hemolytic, no. And normally you would see that on a plate for Staphylococcus aureus. The pigment, no pigment at all. So you kind of look at it. If you're looking fast, you can see right through it. The normal things that it would express outward that you recognize as Staphylococcus when you're doing diagnostics, it does not have. It's sensitive to aminoglycosides and antibiotics? No, it is not. And intracellular survival, it certainly can stay inside the body without being recognized for months before it starts to break out to be an infection.
If you think about the whole reimbursement model, anybody who's readmitted with a surgical site infection, unless you're talking about an implant, it's only a 30-day period. And then, you get dinged with, obviously the cost of getting that infection treated. But I feel like once you're over 30 days, that doesn't happen. You're saying that some of these infections are taking much longer than that to appear, and it might even be skewing our data. I'm not really so concerned about the financial model in that question, other than if that's where the money is tracking it, that's probably where the data is tracking it.
Exactly. And since it's so hard to identify, they may even have a port. They've gone ahead and checked and pulled out some fluids. And, oh no, it must be just a reaction that you're having, just a long-term irritation, because they're not coming up with the organisms either. But you're right. Financially, it can be a real issue because it is the same one that started. I have a patient we have given talks together, and he has, in his 4th time, it has been repeated in the same Staphylococcus. And likely, this is part of the issue.
So really, the infection's just sitting there hiding in the tissue.
Yes.
And it's hiding there, masked, not looking like what we're expecting to see. And then it finally manifests itself months later, and oh yeah, we still have this infection. It was just lurking in the background for months on end.
Exactly. That's exactly true. And it's
wow.
And it's not just with Staphylococcus. It's also Pseudomonas, E. coli, Enterobacter, Serratia marcescens, Neisseria, Yersinia, Salmonella, Vibrio, and Lactobacillus. And there are more as well. They keep finding more and more. And one of the things that unfortunately we increase the probability of it appearing is to use the aminoglycosides. So it's very important that we look to these, and some of the treatments, like with, for example, using gentamicin, preliminarily puts a lot of pressure on Staphylococcus. And when then it will produce more of these little guys, these tiny bacteria that are just not recognized. So it is just the same as all. We adapt to everything that is pressure, and we're just recognizing now that this is one of the responses of bacteria.
Mm.
Wow.
So, Wava, I think you've sufficiently scared our audience. I mean, definitely something that we all need to be thinking about. There's a number of topics. You and I have talked about all kinds of conversations. We've talked about lint and particles and particulates getting left behind in surgical sites. We've talked about all kinds of biofilm and biofilm formation in the past. But honestly, I don't think we've ever talked about, especially the impact related to anesthesiology. So you're always bringing something new and interesting to the table. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely. I appreciate this opportunity. I really do, guys.
All right, that was Dr. Wava Truscott joining us to talk during our infection prevention season. And I can just tell you, and you heard just a small amount of the work that she's done and some of the insights, but microbiology, as she said, Melanie, that's her favorite area. And really, a lot of the things that we have talked about with her in the past on the other shows all weave together when you think about biofilms and lint and particles and how these organisms grow and these small colony variants just continue to create issues. And she even threw something out for us about orthopedics after we stopped recording. That is another one of those things that you don't hear about very often that is going to eventually get a lot of our attention. She's very much ahead of the curve.
She really is. She knows her stuff, and listening to her talk, especially with the statistics on just how long these different bacteria and viruses and fungi, how long they can live on surfaces. I think we just sometimes get comfortable. It doesn't look dirty. We can't see anything. It must be fine. And then finding out that these things can live for so long. What are we exposing ourselves to? What are we exposing our patients to? And then what are we exposing our families to when we go home? So it's a lot to think about, and really probably gives you, like I said, the heebie-jeebies, but it's good to know so that we can educate ourselves and make sure that we are following the best practices for infection prevention and cleaning like we should.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.